Starting recording, of course. So the first thing that I wanted to do was to show you homework 0. Yesterday I got the homework system for both classes up and running, and I wanted to walk us through that. So if you don't have it open already, please go to the course webpage where the link is now available. And we will start there. Also on the webpage is the video from last time posted in the same box with the classes. So this is where you can go to find what you missed if you weren't there or if you want to watch it again. I also have organized all of the videos into a playlist on YouTube. So if you go to my YouTube channel and hit subscribe, smash that like button. Make sure to check out the merch. Oh wait, I don't have any. I think my merch would say something like Happy Garbage Day. Something also random like the things that I say. But anywho, you can get to the videos that way, or you can get there from the website. And as you will see, I don't edit anything. I hit record, I hit stop, and 5 mouse clicks later, it's on YouTube. So all of my silly mistakes and all of the things that went wrong are recorded for posterity. I am not a real YouTuber, although that's now what my son wants to be when he grows up, is a YouTuber, which is a profession that I did not know existed until fairly recently. I also did not know that you could buy a Mr. Beast burger anywhere in the country until fairly recently, but apparently that is also a thing. So we're all learning new things. All right, did you find the link? Okay, if you click the link, then, let me see, which one do I have here? Oh, I need to go back so I can log in. So this is the screen that you should see. Your last name you would enter according to what it is in Maui. It's not case sensitive, but it is space sensitive. So if you use a hyphen, put your hyphen in there. If you use a space, put your space in. I have a series of dummy logins that I use, so I'm going to log in with person 2. Your 8-digit ID is the number that goes with your Iowa account, not your password. So if you don't know it already, you'll have to get it out and look it up, but once you enter it once into your device, hopefully it will stay there. For my dummy login, I'm going to enter theirs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then I hit sign in, and you should have a landing page that looks like this. So this landing page for this class is going to have not just the canned homeworks as they become available, so everything you've done up to this point and anything that's new will be here, but this is also where you will go to download your written feedback on your written assignments. So I have a system where it writes a custom link for each of you, so there will be a link to my feedback, and you can download your Word assignments and the comments from here once we get to that point. There's also your current point totals figured out so that you'll know at any point in the semester where you stand with respect to your grades. I will say that after the canned homeworks are finished, these point totals are not updated automatically. That is something that I do separately after I download the data, make sure everything's okay, and then I feed it through the part that does the point totals. So these will take a day or two after an assignment usually for me to get them finished. But this one is homework 0, so we're going to hit begin or continue. So in this class, there are 2 different types of questions that you will have. Some are numeric and some are multiple choice. This class is not going to have the paragraph completion questions that the other classes have had, because every other assignment, you get to write your own paragraphs instead. So, and I will give you templates to follow, but it will be your own writing, and so you'll get practice in that format. Any data files that you will need to analyze for your homework will be located up here in this first section. It will tell you how many points. It should be 2 points, not 3. So here's my first typo of the semester to be fixed. That didn't take long. And the due date for that. But we can go ahead and complete them together. So how many regular homeworks are planned for this semester in this class?
6.
Yeah, it is 6 in this class. It's 5 in the other class. Let me show you what happens if you get it wrong. I'm going to hit 7 and hit enter, and you'll see that it turns red. So you'll get immediate feedback as to whether or not you have any of these answers correct. I'm going to hit the correct answer 6, hit enter, and it turns green. How many points are these homeworks worth in this class?
90.
Yeah, it's 90 out of 100. And how many points will you lose if you complete any homework even a minute late? It's 2. It's just 2 period, though, not 2 per day, or it's just 2. However, how many points are you getting from doing this right now?
3.
Yeah, it says 3, but I had intended to. It used to be 3 because I used to have 3 points late. So I'm scaling it back down, but it's usually commensurate. So you can enter multiple answers at the same time and hit enter, and they will all be graded. So once something turns green, you no longer have access to change it. You don't have to worry about having to redo anything. It will just be saved inside the system. Then we have results questions, which will be focused on more general interpretation. They'll all be in a multiple choice format. So my campus office is where?
Second.
Yeah, I am technically in the south side, although it's located in the bridge. However, if you want to talk to me, do not hang out outside my office hoping for me to walk by. It's not going to work. I'll just tell you that right now. I don't hang out there very much. I didn't hang out there very much before COVID, and I certainly don't now. If you want to find me, email me. That is the most reliable way to get a hold of me. And sometimes I'll suggest that we hop on Zoom if you're able to talk, or you can come to my office hours, or we can set up individual meetings, but I don't hang out on campus very much. My office hours, that being said, are going to be where? In my office, at the Come and Go across the street, at the Chipotle across the street the other way, or in my basement at home.
Basement.
It's in front. Yep, you'll get to see my basement on Zoom. And I was there yesterday for an hour and no one showed up. But I was there. Speaking of which, my office hours will be held when? This semester.
Mondays and Wednesdays.
Yes.
4:30.
See, this is how you know that I actually want you to come. If I didn't want people to come to my office hours, then 3:30 in the morning would be an excellent time to have them. Or 8 o'clock at night, as it were. And if no one is there, I will indeed find something to do and stay there just in case, so both 2 and 3. So these questions, once you select your answer, you can make sure that it gets saved by hitting this button, check and save. You can shut the web page down and come back to it at any point, and your previous work will be there waiting for you. All of the answers you've already selected will be saved. You'll note that none of these are showing red and green yet. That will happen after the due date has passed, and then you'll be able to get your feedback, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. Second part here, how many points are formative assessments worth in this class? Out of 100? 10. It's the 10. Yeah, I try to keep the points easy. The class is worth 100 unless I drop something, in which case everything scales proportionately. How many days are we supposed to be here?
2.
2. And how many regular class periods are we currently scheduled not to meet at all?
1.
1. In early October, I'm going to a conference, and we won't be here on Thursday of that week. There's a couple dates in which we'll meet on Zoom only, but we'll still be meeting at a synchronous time. Last but not least here, actually I'm going to hit the enter so we can get those in. There we go. And the class will use M+, which is available on virtual desktop. Or for those of you who are rich, as we discussed last time, you can buy your own student license, although I would suggest spending your money elsewhere if you are in fact rich. Original assignments based on individual data should be submitted how? What do you think? Icon, yes please. Do not print your homework out. I don't like paper. It's been several decades since I had homework due on paper. I used to do it via individual emails, and that was very overwhelming. So, icon. I will have a spot for it under assignments with instructions, and you can upload your document and any associated files to icon. And likewise, revisions, also submitted via icon. You will have a separate link to submit a revision if you so choose. So there are due dates on the syllabus for when revisions are due. If you are happy with the points that you have, you don't have to revise them. It's up to you. And then last but not least, this class will be a cakewalk, a nightmare, or challenging but in a good way.
Challenging, but in a good way.
That's my goal. So a cakewalk is an expression that means something that's very, very easy. Nightmare, of course, very, very bad. I'm going for something in the middle. So once I finish the last question, you might say to yourself, okay, I'm done. but you're not done. At least once a semester, somebody forgets this. You have to actually submit your answers in order for them to be graded. So I have a button here that says Submit Final Answers that I'm going to click. Once you hit that button, your green answers stay green, but any of the other ones just become black, so they're no longer available. That way you can read through them again if you want to. You get to the bottom of the whole thing, and you have two choices. You can either go back and change something, which will take you back to the previous screen, or you can enter your 8-digit ID number again as a way to submit your work. So I'm going to do that here. I'm person number 2, and it should say, "Thank you, your answers have been submitted," and it will tell you when you can log back in to see your score. So this is what it will look like until after the due date passes. Here is what it will look like after the fact. I have another one pulled up here. It will say View Submitted Answers, and then in the computational questions, any answers that you couldn't get will be red, either the last thing you tried or it will just be blank if you never answered it, followed by what it should have been in green. So that way you can work backwards to figure out what the answer should have been. I am happy to talk to anyone about this process and help them troubleshoot. However, I tend not to go over these in class because not everybody will have finished it by the deadline, and I don't want to give the fun away. So this way you can work on your own to correct your own mistakes and get individual help if you need to. Likewise, if you answer any of these questions incorrect, your red answer will be shown, followed by what it should have been in green, so that you've got feedback on that as well. And then at the bottom, it will tell you your point totals. So it looks like I got, here's the 3 points that's incorrect. I will fix all of this to change it to 2. This is all algorithmic. But I want to highlight in terms of strategy, if you are one of those people who is a perfectionist and it bothers you, like you have one question left and you keep trying it and you keep trying it, and let's say that it's 11:58 and you can't email me for help because I will have gone to bed 2 hours ago. It might be worth the hit for the one question to not turn it in late. Because if you miss one question, it's just a fraction of a point. Whereas if you turn it in late, it's 2 full points. So it's okay if the homework isn't all the way done. Ideally, it would be mostly done so that you can get as many points as possible. And then you can come back to the landing page and see where you're at. All right. Any questions on that? So homeworks 2, 4, and 6 will be of this kind, where you plug in your answers. That way you will get practice interacting with software, interacting with material before you have to go and do it on your own data. All right. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Let me make sure I'm recording. Yes, I am. That's good. All right, so if you haven't done it with me, please finish it by Monday if you can. That way I can make sure I can troubleshoot any problems before the system needs to go live, and you get your 2 points extra credit. Otherwise, we can talk about what we talked about last time. There, that's prettier than the slides. A nice beach background to get us motivated. What is this class about? Let's start there. What are you here for?
To learn about latent trait measurement models?
Yeah, latent trait measurement models, broadly construed, of which special names get used for special forms of them, but more generally measuring latent traits and how to evaluate reliability with respect to items and dimensionality and all that good stuff. Yes, indeed. What else do you remember from last time? We didn't get very far, but we got a little bit. Everyone's looking down. Please don't call on me. Please don't call on me. I rarely cold call on people unless I know that they're going to be okay with it. We started talking about theories and stuff. Synonyms. Let's do that. Give me synonyms for latent trait. True score. Yeah. What else? It is a random variable, although that's a much more general term, but I'll take it. What else?
Unobservable construct?
Unobservable construct, I'll take that. How about other words that go with latent? Theta? See? Theta works too, yeah.
Factor score.
Factor scores. Unobserved, yep. We got unobserved variable, unobserved construct, unobserved factor. All of those words mean the same thing. When you're writing papers, by the way, I would suggest picking one word and sticking with it so that you don't inadvertently confuse your reader. But different people will talk about these in different ways. We started talking about this a little bit, but what determines whether you need, say, a confirmatory factor analysis model or an item response factor model or something like that, or any other kind? How do those things differ from each other if they all are designed to measure latent traits?
The kind of indicator?
The kind of indicator, meaning the type of observed response that is thought to be caused by the latent trait. The different models have different names for different kinds of responses. So if you had general linear models, and if you've seen generalized linear models, which is extensions of regression for not normal things, all of that is going to show right back up in here. The main difference is that in those models, everything is observed. You have predictors that are stored in your data set. You have responses that are stored in your data set. In these models, the predictor is the latent trait, and it is not observed. That's the big difference. The model is going to try to describe what it would be, but it's never actually observed. So we were talking a little bit about history, and starting with all the different kinds of theories, like classical test theory. We stop by that for just a little bit next week, because the big issue with classical test theory is that the core thing we're looking at is the sum across items. According to classical test theory, the sum across items is the latent trait. That is our best guess as to what it would be. And that gives us very little flexibility in being able to compare scores across people and items where we might have different items potentially contributing to the score. Then we started talking about the variance of common factor models, where we don't just have the sum across items, and instead we work with the individual item responses to try to indicate the trait. And the first one we talked about was CFA, confirmatory factor analysis, or confirmatory factor models. You can call them either of those. I tend to do CFA as the acronym for this. CFA, functionally speaking, is the same thing as linear regression. So what we are predicting is an item response. We predict it from an item-specific intercept. And an intercept, as we learned in the last class, is what? What's the definition of an intercept? Not a trick question.
The expected score when the factor is 0.
Yeah, the intercept more generally is the expected outcome when the predictors are 0. In this case, the outcome is the item response, or the indicator response, and the predictor is the latent trait, or the latent factor. So for somebody who has an F of 0, which in these models typically means they're at the average level, that's something we usually fix for identification purposes, more on that later, then this term here, mu, gives us the expected item response for the typical person. Then we have this thing lambda, which is going to be a slope. So in terms of notation, I just decided this is a rule a few minutes ago with Nathan. I'm going to adopt it for this class. A multiplier of a variable is called a slope if the variable is observed. If it's latent, that same multiplier is called a loading instead. It's a terminology difference, but it means the same thing. So this lambda thingy right here is a factor loading that describes how the item response y changes for a 1-unit difference in the factor. So how does the model say a different response would be predicted for somebody who has more of a trait versus somebody who has less of a trait versus somebody who has very little of the trait? And E is what's left. Anytime that you make a prediction model, you're not going to get it perfect. So E is the difference between what the actual response is and what the model says. So in terms of the subscripts here, apologies for those of you who are in longitudinal with me because the subscripts change across classes. I in this class is for item, S is for subject. So this single equation is actually a series of equations because it's Y for each item across subjects. The first intercept only has an I because it is an item property. Likewise, the slope, the loading here, has an I because it's an item property, whereas F only has an S because it's a subject property. So both item characteristics and subject characteristics contribute to the prediction of each item response. That differentiation means that we can have comparable latent traits even if people get different items. And that could happen by accident, or it could happen on purpose, like adaptive testing. Right? The idea of adaptive testing is that you don't waste people's time with things they should already know or things that are too hard for them. So by definition, each person is going to get a different set of items. Yet to be able to talk about their verbal ability or their quantitative ability or whatever you're trying to measure, you got to have some way of putting that all back together again. So as long as we have a separability of a person characteristic from the item characteristics that go together to create a response, then we can have different items be administered and still have the potential to have comparability of scores. If the latent trait were just the average of the items or the sum of the items, then we can't do that because it matters which items you got, otherwise you're going to get a different sum or a different average. The big part of CFA is dimensionality that is specified by you. So this is the simplest case where each item is thought to be reflecting one factor. Could I have more than one factor?
Yeah.
Sure. It's up to you. So if you said that, let's say that you think that there's two factors and every item measures every factor, that's exploratory factor analysis where you don't really know what you have. If you say these items measure this factor and those items measure that factor, that's confirmatory because you can be wrong. So these models are empirical statements about how the item responses relate to each other that can be verified or rejected based on comparison with what the model says should happen versus what the data says should happen. So in a one-factor case like this, at a minimum, this model says that all of the item responses should be correlated. The correlation between the items is actually going to be predicted by these slopes. So if the items aren't correlated, they can't possibly be measuring something in common. So we can look at the actual pattern of correlation and compare that to what the model says it's supposed to look like, and that's how we judge whether we're on the right track, whether it's one thing or two things. We can specify factors that have to do with content, or we can specify them that have to do with what's known as method factors, or the way we ask the questions. So if you have positively worded items and negatively worded items, that is often going to require more than one factor. One for the content, one for the way it's worded. You can set up all of that. It's up to you. One thing that's problematic with this type of model, though, even though it's very nice and simple and it's elegant in its simplicity, if the factor keeps going up and up and up and up and up, what happens to Y according to this model?
Increase.
Up and up and up and up and up, linearly, forever and ever. Now, how many types of items have you seen on surveys or tests that have no boundaries? I can't think of any, to be honest. The closest I can come up with is something like response time, but that still has a lower bound of 0 or whatever the minimum is that it takes for you to hit the mouse. So what do you think happens if you have, like, let's say it is a, and I never remember this one I'm trying to say, it's a Likert scale, not a Likert scale. If you have like a 1 to 5 scale and the factor keeps going up and up, like it can't go past 5, right? The model doesn't understand that. So even though this type of model is probably still most common for ordinal type of item responses, it's not the best choice. It's only going to work for ordinal responses that have enough categories where the distribution is reasonably symmetric. So we need a different kind of model to deal with the fact that this loading has to understand that it has to shut off as we get close to the top of the scale and the bottom of the scale. And as we talked about last time, this set of item characteristics, the loadings in particular, inform us about how we might select amongst alternative items. A loading that is stronger indicates a better item in terms of how it relates to the trait. So it's not just increasing reliability by having more items, it's increasing reliability by having more better items. But according to this model, this is a constant. So that means that it's better for everybody. An item that has a stronger slope is a better item, period, according to this model, because the slope goes on forever and ever. That is not the case once we switch to models that are designed for binary or ordinal data, which is what the next piece is about. So this will be like, I'd say a month, maybe 5 weeks or something, learning. This is the big picture. The details are forthcoming. All right, how are we doing so far? Rumors? Seeing nodding heads and thumbs?
I have a question.
Hit me.
So when we think about just like regular plain old regression, we talk about like a 1 unit increase in our predictor variable, right?
Yep.
I'm assuming factor loadings, like the concept is still the same.
It is
like,
exactly the same.
Conceptually, like we don't necessarily have to define, like just saying an increase in your factor loading is sufficient in this case. We kind of like.
The loading dictates an increase in the expected response.
Right.
Yes. And so we call it a slope if it's multiplying a variable we really have. We call it a loading if it's multiplying a variable that's latent.
Yes.
Yes.
But I'm saying like the exact discrete 1 unit change.
Yes.
Like, okay, really what I'm asking you is I have a different paper where like conceptually what a 1 unit change in the like an actual observed variable means is actually kind of difficult to like describe.
Yeah.
But conceptually it's still just a 1 unit change, right?
Yes.
Like I understand what the slope means because of that. And I'm just curious if like we're less concerned about what an actual 1 unit change means. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think I follow. So I think what you're reacting to is the fact that f is imaginary. Right? So like how can you even talk about what a unit is, right? Let alone 1 unit. What the hell's a unit? Well, that's a great question. So from that perspective, I would say that we don't put the same emphasis on the numbers because the numbers have to be scaled relevant to how we define what a unit is. And that's one of the things that is like the first step in all of this is what's known as model identification. You have to give your pretend f variable a mean and a variance for any of this to make sense. It doesn't actually matter, though, what those numbers are. You have to set it, and so everything then is relative to that. So once you know what a unit is, and for that reason, the most common thing that people do with these f's is say their mean is 0 and their standard deviation is 1. Therefore, a unit is a standard deviation increase in this variable. So then it's like pseudo-standardized. I hesitate to use that word because y isn't, but the f is standardized. Yep. Yeah, and so that's why in evaluating these models, it's very convenient if you go with the 0, 1 because then the loadings make ready sense. Otherwise, if you estimate the factor variance instead, then you have to figure out what a unit is and like whether that's a lot or a little, and it gets a little squishy.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Zoomers, are you guys doing okay? Any questions? Good, thumbs, all right. So yes, great idea in theory, not going to be applicable to most types of item data, but it's easy, estimation is fast, and this is the stuff that people finally figured out how to get computers to do in the late 70s. So then we have just a little bit about sort of the development of where these models started and how they progressed. And I don't want to dwell on the history so much as I want to dwell on the dates. Because there is a misconception that factor analysis and structural equation models and latent trait models and IRT and all this is advanced and modern. It is not. It is old. They just didn't have computers to make it go. And now we do. And so the ceiling is much, much higher than it used to be in terms of what is possible and what people are expected to know. But back in the day, you had to have like you know, a special like apparatus to be able to do any of this. And so a lot of the theoretical work preceded the actual algorithmic development. But this stuff is old inherently. So we get through the 40s, the 50s, then we have Yorskog is credited with the development of the first software package to actually estimate these things called Lizral. And from what Susan Emmertson told me, like when people started actually doing this in the 80s, they were called Lizralites. Like it was a particular like group of people who like knew the secret code to make this stuff go, and not everybody had access to it. But now everybody has access to it. But the thing is that all of these developments do not address the problem that the model needs to understand where the boundaries of the outcome are so that it doesn't predict something to go past what is logically possible. So what do we do about that? Item response theory to the rescue, or otherwise known as a generalized version of this CFA. So when you see these models that I'm about to talk about described in papers, they're going to be called lots of different things. They might be called IRT models, item response theory models. They might be called item factor analysis models. They might be called confirmatory factor models for categorical data. Each of those terms means a different combination of what the model looks like and how it's estimated. So they're yoked together in a way that makes this a little bit tricky to see at first glance. But it is the same type of model, even if it looks very different. So IRT resulted from a combination of psychophysical research and measurement modeling traditions, and we hit into the 1950s and 60s where this type of model started to take off. So the big picture is that binary responses are predicted from latent traits in the same way that binary outcomes are predicted by any kind of predictor using logistic regression. It is the exact same thing. If you know what a logit is, if you know what a probit is, you are home free. If you do not know what those things are, we will talk about them, but it will go better if you have a chance to review those sections of the generalized modeling class, because everything hinges on that. Likewise, if you understand regression models for categorical outcomes, nominal are known as multinomial in a lot of cases, or ordinal is known as proportional odds, those are the same thing as what are known as polytomous IRT models. And I discovered all of this way too late in my education. So I will tell you a very brief anecdote. I told you I took item response theory from Susan Emmertson, and she was like she still is one of the big people in the IRT world. And so I was fortunate to have that class. And she kept saying things like, well, the model's linear in the logit, and that's why it's good. And I was sitting there nodding, and then in my head, I'm like, what the hell's a logit? And why does it matter that it's linear? Never understood what a logit was for. Never got it. And then I audited a class on generalized models at Penn State as a postdoc, and he went over logistic regression and ordinal regression, and I was like, oh my God, that's this stuff. I get it now. And that was like 3 years later, and a lot of struggle. So I want to save you from that struggle and point out these parallels right away. The same link functions that allow you to transform a bounded response into something that is unbounded are being hijacked for the same purposes. It's just that the predictor variable is your latent trait instead of something you have in your data set. The term IRT in particular is referring to a particular combination of how these models are expressed, which looks very different than a standard regression model, and the use of what's known as full information estimation. When you see this word, full information, what it means is that you are using all of the original data to estimate your model parameters. That is in contrast with limited information, which means you are starting with a summary of your data and you are using that summary as the basis to estimate your model parameters. If all of your variables are supposed to be conditionally normally distributed, those two things end up at the same place. If you have categorical data, they do not. So the use of the term IRT in particular refers to a combination of that way of estimating it plus the way that they express it that looks crazy different from regression but actually isn't. The term Rash Model, have you heard this term before? A few people? A Rash model is a special case of an IRT model where you pretend that all of the items are equally related to the trait. That's my version of it, but don't let any Rash people hear me saying that or they will come out and find me. Rash is a very different philosophical viewpoint because from their perspective, there are no alternative models. If your data don't fit the Rash model, you fix your data. You don't pick a new model. It's very different. But I view it as a special case of IRT. So what are they for? To fit factor analysis type models to different kinds of outcomes that are not continuous and plausibly normal. It allows you to then think about whether an item is good or not in the context of where it is good and for whom. So I'll show a picture in a minute that illustrates this idea. But one of the things that's touted as a benefit to IRT is actually a benefit to all of these models. The idea of separation of persons and items. If you are predicting each item response and you're doing it with characteristics of the item and characteristics of the person, that separates the two so that scores do not have to have the same items to be comparable. That is true in factor analysis, it's true in IRT, and it's true in any model that has a separate latent trait as the predictor, different from the sum of the items. So here's a predictor. Here's a picture, I should say. Picture and predictor. This is how IRT models are almost always described. So you will get used to seeing these types of pictures. What you are looking at here is a graph predicting the probability on the y-axis of answering a 1 instead of a 0. So a binary item response, in the most simplest case, getting the answer right, if you're talking about an ability test, or endorsing a symptom, if you're thinking about like a psychology or clinical setting. What's on the x-axis is our friend theta, otherwise known as? Yeah, all that stuff, the latent trait, the thing we're trying to measure, that thing, it's theta. I have it as ability here, but because that's often what you see in a testing context, but you can think of it as whatever trait. And per your question, Nikki, the units, right? There is no idea that without knowing more information, I would know what to make of this x-axis. So theta is imaginary, but I'm supposed to know what a 2 is? Like only if you have it identified such that you know what the mean and variance of theta is, and that's something that you control, then I can interpret what 2 means relative to that. In the majority of cases when you see these pictures, they're assuming you know that theta has a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1, such that 2 means somebody who's 2 standard deviations above average are at roughly the, 95th percentile or something, picturing the bell curve type of thing. These individual lines are actually predictions. They're bendy because the model understands that you can't go past a probability of 1 or a probability of 0. So this is a nonlinear relationship for each of these different item responses in the different colored lines, nonlinearly related to theta. So if we look at this last line here, this green line, this line would be considered, this item would be considered a very difficult item in that anybody who has low ability, even up to 0, basically has no shot at getting this right. And as theta increases, they get to have a shot, but it takes a whole lot of theta for them to have a really good shot at this. So this would be a very severe symptom, something like suicidal ideation and depression, as opposed to, feeling worthless or sad, something that's very extreme. This would be, multidimensional calculus on the GRE quantitative section, whatever it goes up to. In contrast with the pink item over here, this would be considered an easier item because people of lower ability do have a shot at getting it right, and basically anybody who's above average or higher is going to have almost nearly a perfect shot at getting this right. So these curves differ in 4 different respects. There's probably more, but it goes up to 4 most commonly. The slope of the line, the difficulty of the line, which is sort of where it is on this x-axis, and also if there's an asymptote. So this pink line, for instance, has an asymptote potentially given, let's say, a multiple choice format. if you have 4 choices, you have a 25% chance of getting it correct, right? Even if you're the dumbest person on the planet, you have a 25% chance. So it asymptotes such that even if theta goes back and back and back and back over here, this pink line doesn't go below that lower asymptote. And the same can be true over here on the upper side as well. Question?
What happens if we don't want to accept that ability is normally distributed?
Then,
Wait, can we put a pin in that one? 'Cause
yeah.
I just want to clarify what you were saying about the lower asymptote.
Okay,
That's
start with that.
related. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
I was
No,
like-
no, you're fine, you're fine.
So the lower asymptote is basically like random chance of like
It-
dependent upon the number.
It is the probability of having a 1 at sort of the lowest possible level of theta that there is on the,
which should converge on
yeah,
like,
it is the end of where the
calculating
line.
the actual probability.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry Zoomers, I'm zooming my line off camera here.
Thank you.
Okay, no.
Yes, and the upper asymptote is the same. So like, let's say that you have a psychopathy, is that the word I want? Crazy people who do mean things. Is that psychopathy? Can I be a clinical psychologist today? Anyone? No one's going to argue with me? Sure. Okay, or counseling.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't do clinical work.
Yeah. So let's say you're a crazy person who does mean things. We'll stick with that. And you have an item like, how likely are you to set your neighbor's cat on fire? Well, you're a crazy person who does mean things, and so, yeah, I'll do that. But maybe you know, wait a minute, if I say yes, then am I going to get the police at my door? And maybe I shouldn't say yes to that, so I'm just going to say no. Like there's, the upper asymptote works the same way. Like the probability doesn't necessarily go up to 1, even if you're super high on the trait, because you could still screw up, or you could choose not to endorse something for other reasons. So these lines can be bounded on the lower or upper end for reasons that have to do with either the trait or the administration of the test. The big things that we pay attention to is where the item is, its difficulty or severity, and then how steep it is. So the worst case scenario would be if these lines are completely flat. That would mean that regardless of how much ability you have the same probability of getting it right. That's another way of saying this does not measure that ability. A good item has a steep slope. But then it begs the question, good for whom? This pink item is useful in differentiating people of relatively low ability. It is not helpful in differentiating the ability of people who are really good. They're all at ceiling. You need a green item to differentiate the people who are really good. This green item is not helpful in differentiating the people who are really low. So what a good item is depends on who you want it to be good for. Because the slope has to shut off. It has to. And in ordinal data, it is the exact same y-axis with a difference in definition. In ordinal data, what we're going to do is carve up, say if you have a 5-category response, it gets carved up into a series of 4 binary sub-responses of 1 versus something greater than 1. 1, 2 versus 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3 versus 4, 5. And 1, 2, 3, 4 versus 5. And then each of those different binary responses gets a different place, but they all share the same slope. And so then you're predicting the probability of answering the higher choice of the 2 as the 1, but the models function exactly the same way. So what these models are, even though they look different in their form, they are factor analysis models where theta is still the predictor, and we have item characteristics, but the prediction happens through a link function that constrains the predicted outcomes into the space they're supposed to be in, between 0 and 1. This is what it looks like if you write it out as a linear model, which looks crazy. It's this A thing multiplied by multiplying theta minus, what? When have you seen a linear model with a minus sign in it? That's just weirdness. But yeah, this is what it is. So IRT models look really different than regression models, but they are asymptotically the same thing. You can rearrange it and get back and forth, and I will show you that. I'm not showing that today, because that's a lot, but just trust me, I can do a little bit of math, and this will look like a regular old logistic regression in no time. These versions of the item parameters, I think, are more useful in describing the characteristics of the item than a regression version is, because they're related to a different definition of what 0 means as a reference, but we will get there. So we will be dealing with this word link here. This is going to be either a link function that is known as a logit, which is log odds. It's the log of the odds of the probability of a 1. Or we will be dealing with one that is called probit, which is the z-score that goes with the area to the left under a cumulative normal distribution. That z-score probit thing is called ogive in IRT land, but it is the exact same concept. And both of those are tricks that we use to create a predicted outcome that can go on forever and ever. And when you back translate that into the actual 0 or 1 outcome, it stays within those boundaries. So this is like probably another 5 weeks of class or something. It's just describing how this works and what to do with the model parameters. And so what we will do, estimate directly, is what's known as item factor analysis, because it gives you something like an intercept and something like a loading that you can then back translate into these A and B things. And you can do that in software. What gets very tricky about all of these things is that what you actually get on your output is program specific. So if you use, let's see, M+, you get something called a threshold, which is -1 times an intercept and a loading. If you use IRT packages, you might get A's and B's. If you use MERT in R as a package, I believe you get intercept slopes. And so you really have to know what you're looking at to know what the numbers mean. So it's not just like, what's a 2, but what kind of 2 is this? Because a B of 2 is not the same as an intercept of 2, is not the same as a threshold of 2, but they're all called locations. Not to scare you all, but I want you to be prepared. I will help, I promise. So this idea that the slopes have to shut off then allows you to think about reliability not as one number, like I have a reliability of 0.8. It's like, no, at each point of theta, you have a different reliability based on how many items you have there. So like somebody who has an ability of 3, they probably have pretty crappy reliability because there's only one item that's not at ceiling for them. Somebody who has a theta of 0 probably has much better reliability because there's a lot more information. They can say yes or no to a lot of things and help to narrow down exactly where they are. Likewise, someone who's over here, not as much information. So information is literally what it's called, reliability in this context, and you can see sort of along this continuum of latent space where your holes are, and that would dictate what kind of items you need. So if I wanted to improve this instrument, I would probably need more harder items, and I might need some easier items too. The middle is probably pretty well taken care of. And we will quantify that as well. All right, so then yes, IRT, not new. 50s, 60s, and 70s. It's the software that's new. All right, so summarizing where we've been so far, we have classical test theory that works with the sum across items as the indicator of the trait. We're going to break that into predicting each item response specifically using a person's trait as a latent variable and item characteristics. The way the model works is going to depend on what kind of response we're predicting. And we can have other kinds too. So, by the way, Jonathan's planning on tricking some of you in his class with this. Don't tell him I gave you the heads up. But he's planning on building this sort of idea that not all items have to be the same. Yeah, it's true. Don't look at me like that. It's not scary. It's going to be okay. But this idea, because that's one thing that people don't think about. It's like, well, what if I have one item that a linear model is okay for, but I want to have a binary item too, and then I want to have a count? You can do that. It just isn't called anything. But each of these models can be customized for each different item as need be. All right, so what are the advantages of doing this? Testing assumptions, that's the big one. So if you create a scale, or if you're using a scale that someone else created, it doesn't matter which case it is, I believe the onus is on you to make sure that the items are working in the way that you think they are before you do anything with those responses. When people sum items together, they are assuming, without testing, if that's all they do, that those items measure one thing. If your items actually measure two different things and you add them together, then what do you get? You can have a mid-range score because you're really good at one thing and really bad at another, or you could have a mid-range score because you're mediocre at both. Then how does having a score help you do anything with that information if it's not one trait? So we can explicitly test whether it's one thing, two things, three things, whether you need a different type of model based on how items are worded, for instance, whether you can think about responses from a child's, say, teacher in the same way that you can think about responses from a child's parent, or whether those need to be different factors. There's a lot of instances in which dimensionality is up for grabs based on someone's theoretical framework and the way they wrote the items. It also provides you with more concrete guidelines to build a scale or to build a short form. Like if you're going to make a short form out of something, you want the items that load the highest, but you also want the items that cover the spectrum of what you're trying to measure. Highest within a really narrow range is only good if you only care about measuring in that range. It provides you with a way to establish comparability across different samples, items, and occasions. So if you have overlap, you can change the items that you give over time and still be measuring the same trait in theory. It allows you to test whether items work the same way across different occasions and persons. That's called two different things based on which type of model you're in. So measurement equivalence or measurement invariance. Have you heard these terms before? Basically refers to, does the item work the same way to measure this trait across groups, occasions, or other types of samples? So if I have an item, let's say measuring something like depression, and one of the symptoms is lack of energy, that might be fine if I'm giving my survey to a sample of respondents that are physically healthy and don't have any other issues. But if I give a depression inventory to a sample of older adults, and I have an item that says something like lack of energy, do you think that someone who has a lack of energy is necessarily depressed, or might they have other health problems that they're answering that question about? So lack of energy might not mean the same thing to someone who's from a healthy population from someone who's from a less healthy population. Conduct behavior problems. If you have a 2-year-old who bites people, that is very different than having a 16-year-old who bites people. Right? Very different type of pathology, behavior, whatever going into that. So being able to test whether things work the same way and allow them to work differently if not. So you can still measure conduct problems from 2-year-olds to 16-year-olds, but you should probably let that biting item work differently depending on the age. That would be considered non-invariance, meaning different. And just for fun, we take that same idea and we completely flip the vocabulary backwards when we get to IRT, because differential item functioning is the same thing as non-invariance. Just for fun, we're just going to make it backwards. So it's the same exact set of concerns if you're dealing with a bounded confirmatory factor model versus an unbounded one. And we'll do all of that too. Construct validity, internal and external evidence, we'll talk a little bit about that, but the extent to which the latent trait behaves in the way that you think it should is evidence for validity, above and beyond just how it relates to other stuff. And being able to deal with different response formats within the same instrument. So if you have items that have 4-point scales and then 5-point scales and 6-point scales, you could add them all together, but the items that have the most variance are going to contribute to most of the score. You can have different items with different formats within the same trait or across traits, and it ain't no thing in this type of item. So there's a lot of reasons that this type of process is worthwhile. Nathan, answering your question from 15 minutes ago, if theta is not normally distributed, you are in a world of hurt.
But how do they know?
It's imaginary. It doesn't have to be.
That bothers me.
It should. But the good news is that the more you learn, then you will be able to write out models in which theta has other distributions potentially, or empirically derived distributions, but that's not this class. There are people who've thought about that, but it gets even harder to nail down an imaginary variable that you don't know what its shape is. Right? Like, we're pretty far away from, like, what is touchable at that point.
Well, my question
So.
is, like, where does the GRE, or, like, these standards tests fall apart, you know? Because I did not do well on the GRE.
Same
but
here.
I seem to be in a PhD program. So
I seem to be tenured, so we match.
So, like, where does it fall apart?
Where does it fall apart? I have a GRE-based example coming next week,
Okay.
so you may be happy with that. But the GRE, when you get your score, does not give you a standard error with it. And that's because if you saw how big it was, you would not be as impressed with the GRE. They publish it, though. You have to, it's online. They have a ETS guide to interpreting scores where they publish their standard errors, and they actually compute them via simulation so that they are the most optimal versions of what it is. We'll talk about that next week. Anyway, I know. Those of you who tanked the GRE, guess what? It's not everything, clearly. I'm here. You're here. It's fine.
It can change someone's life.
It can. But it's just a test score.
I mean, if we look at like the history of tests, period, and its history with the eugenics movement, like.
Yeah, and that's where like differential item functioning really comes into play with test bias, because you don't want to say that somebody has a lower GRE score because of anything other than their verbal ability or their quantitative ability or their writing, right? Because then you get into trouble. Like there was some classic example about an item referring to a particular kind of boat on a vocabulary test. I don't even know what kind it is. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Well, so, like, you go way back to, like, World War II. There was, like, Army Alpha and Army Beta. And Army Beta was, like, an intelligence test for people who couldn't read. But it had, like, it had pictures and it would have something missing from it. And say, what's missing? And there'd be, like, two people on, like, a tennis court with a net. And they wouldn't have something. If you don't know what tennis is, you don't know that the tennis racket's missing or that the ball is missing. So there were, like, all sorts of funky compounds of, like, you needed to have certain information that's not related to your intelligence to be able to actually do well on this test that was, like, going to affect, like, how you, like, performance in the Army and if you got in or not, if you got,
Yes, that's a good example. Zoomers, did you hear that? I don't know if the microphone picked up that far. It was items from like World War II trying to measure ability. Here, I'm paraphrasing. And for the people who weren't very good at reading, they did picture-based items. But one of the pictures, for example, was like a tennis match, and you're supposed to say what's missing. But if you can't read, odds are good you're not proficient at tennis, and you wouldn't necessarily know what's missing. Yeah, there's another example that is a classic one about, it's like it's supposed to be about vocabulary, but one of the words is like a fancy kind of sailboat that only rich people would know about, and I don't even remember the kind of word it is. I'm like the test case for, I wouldn't know what that is. That sounds right. Yeah, so anyway, the idea of diff is a big deal in the world of testing to ensure a lack of bias and fairness, and items that are suspected of having diff is the way that it's talked about, meaning that something else predicts someone's performance besides the trait, those items get dropped.
But what if the subpopulations are drastically smaller than
The smaller a subpopulation is, the less power you have to detect differences. So if you have a majority group and a minority group, and you don't have very many people in the minority group, then things could look fine because you don't have the power to find the differences.
That sounds problematic.
It does. Yeah, everything you learned about power and sample size still holds. More is better, but in this case, we're trying to find differences, and so a lack of power would be small samples. Would lead you to believe that everything's fine when it's not. But that's actually a good tie to what are the disadvantages? Sample size. So these models do not work reliably until you get into sample sizes of like the hundreds. Particularly IRT models are estimated on thousands and thousands of people. So when I was doing my dissertation, I was planning to use an IRT model to evaluate a new instrument that I was developing, and I had 38 items. And I remember asking Susan, who was on my committee, like, well, can I do a 2PL model, or do I have to stick with a 1PL? Meaning, can I have each item have a different slope, or do I have to pretend like they're all the same to save parameters? And she said, how many people do you have? And I was very proud of myself. I was like, I have 155. And I said it like that because these were older adults that I personally like had to recruit, and I went and tested them, and this was like how I spent my summer vacation every day, doing research. And she laughed at me. She just started laughing. She's like, oh, no, not with 38 items. You need hundreds and hundreds of people for that. Now, it doesn't mean I can't try it. It just means that the estimates are going to be pretty noisy. So I think in a lot of cases, why people go with sort of old school, I'm just going to add these items into a sum and pretend it's fine, is because they don't have the sample size required to pull things off. So that is one important thing to think about. Using maximum likelihood. So there is no such thing as REML for these models, for those of you in the other class. Residual maximum likelihood is an adaptation of maximum likelihood designed for smaller samples. It's not a thing in these models. The software doesn't have it and people don't use it. So none of the things you would have learned about as how to better do small samples are applicable here.
Is it theoretically possible and it just we're not quite there yet with the tech, or is it just not a thing?
So REML is only theoretically possible for models where all of the residuals are conditionally normal. So normal traits, normal e's from your measurement equation. There is one paper that I know of where someone tried to be like, what if we did REML and SEM, and they ultimately came to the conclusion that it wasn't worth the trouble. And I think that's because of this first part. Because to do these models in the first place, you're past the part where REML is supposed to help.
Got it. And then I just quick clarification about sample size. It's people independent of how many items you have, or like if you, for example, had, let's say, 10 items instead of 38.
Then she might not have laughed as hard.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it is somewhat related.
It is related because each item adds more parameters in theory. So if you allow each item to have its own location, like where it's designed for, and you have 38 items, that's 38. But if you have each item have a different slope, that's 38 more parameters. And if you have each item have a different lower asymptote, that's 38 more. Unless you fit some sort of constrained model where items share parameters. But that's why. It's like, how much are you trying to get out of the data, and how much information do you have from people with which to do it? If you got 5 items, that's going to go a lot better than 50. But I did it anyway, so. And it got published, so there. Take that. Yeah, Susan is forever on my shit list, by the way, because when I was 7 months pregnant and she ran into me, she asked me how my baby was doing. And I was like, still in there. But thank you for making me feel good about myself. So, yeah, here's a pro tip. Never ask someone if they're pregnant or about their baby if you're not sure. The correct answer is, how are you feeling? Because then the person will say, oh, I can't wait to get this thing out of me, or they're not sleeping through the night and I'm so tired, and then you'll know how the rest of the conversation is supposed to go. But yeah, pro tip, never ask someone if they're pregnant. Anywho, technical difficulties. A lot of the things that describe these models are hard to read, and I have spent a lot of time reading things and culling the ones that I thought were readable to give to you all. So everything on your reference list, I thought people would have a chance to understand without terribly struggling too much. They certainly vary in levels of difficulty, but I've picked things that I thought would be particularly helpful. And there are also misconceptions as to what these models can and can't do. Structural equation modeling in particular is often known as causal modeling. That is not the case. Cause comes from design. That's it. You can't just take a covariance matrix and say that it means something different in terms of your inferences because you put fancy statistics on it. It doesn't work that way. All right, how are we doing? 3:05. We're doing okay. Questions or comments? All right, then just a little bit of flavor of the types of questions one might ask. So 2 different examples very briefly here, evaluating knowledge of math or evaluating knowledge of depression. So these are 2 very different kinds of latent traits, but the questions that we might ask and the math that we would use to examine the extent to which a given set of items measured those traits coherently are pretty much the same. So for instance, if I have pass or fail items that measure both algebra and geometry, and I have 20 of them, here are some of the questions I might want to know. Well, first off, am I measuring one thing or two? That's an empirical question, because each of those possibilities is consistent with a different pattern of correlation among the items, and you can see which one fits better, or whether you're wrong on both counts. You might be 3. There might be like algebra only, geometry only, or both, or something like that. It could be something else entirely. How do I make a sum score for items that measure both? Well, any item that contributes to both is going to have more weight in making decisions. Do I need all 20 items? What would it look like if I wanted to make the test more efficient? Which ones would I drop, and how would I go about that process? It depends on where they are on the continuum. And how many more do I need if I want to measure people who are designed for, say, gifted education versus people who are needing to be measured for remedial education? Right? Those are 2 very different purposes of measurement, which would require different sets of items. Are there other ways of getting the answer right? So to what extent do these items differ in what would be their lower asymptote, based on guessing, or are the distractors not equally distracting? Could we have multiple tests? So can we put together multiple forms that are equivalent in difficulty, and how would we know that? Adaptive testing, for instance. Floors and ceilings, do we want to avoid those, or are we okay with those? It depends on your purposes of measurement, right? I'll tell you this, you know what kind of distribution that I want in this class at the end when I turn in grades? Straight ceiling. There's actually a name for it. It's called degenerate, and that means it's a constant and not a distribution. That's what I want, a row of A's. Nothing would make me happier than to see a giant ceiling effect in your grade distribution. But if I am trying to select students to be part of gifted and talented ed, then having everybody get every answer right is not going to help my cause. So measurement for different purposes. And then, as we just discussed, are all of these items only about math? If they're embedded in story problems, for instance, I need to worry about the vocabulary used, the reading ability, and to what extent differential reading comprehension and fluency would influence what is supposed to be a math score. Number 2, psychologist types of scales often have Likert responses that go with frequency, like rarely, sometimes, often, almost always, always, that kind of thing. And you'll see things like, I have lots of energy. Rarely, sometimes, often. Like, what does rarely mean? Well, you're hoping someone knows what that means. Particularly for certain kinds of health behaviors, this could be problematic. Like, how often do you brush your teeth? Oh, I do it very often. I do it 3 times a day. How often do I go to the dentist? Very often, 4 times a year. Is that the same kind of very often? Am I supposed to know that? I don't know. We have things that are sort of like, I feel sad. Well, everybody's going to say it at least sometimes they feel sad, versus I think about ending my life. So if I have someone who says they very often feel sad and someone who says they very often feel like ending their life, are those very oftens the same? Probably not. So just adding items up doesn't pay attention to where they are contributing information about ability. All 4s, for instance, are not created equal. So the same questions then. Are there other reasons why someone might endorse these items besides depression? Health problems being a big one, right? That can cause you to not have energy, to not sleep well, and those sorts of things. We would have the same concerns about efficiency, whether we need more items or whether we can get away with fewer. Bias, reliability across the trait, all those kinds of things. So regardless of whether we're approaching this from an educational context, a psychology context, a survey research context, a business marketing, what are the other ones in the class here? Who else do we have? With finance, maybe? No, that's the other class. I'm trying to remember all the places people said they were from. But regardless of where you're from and what you're measuring, the issues are pretty much the same. There's all different kinds of latent traits. All right, so there's a summary of a non-exhaustive potential list. All right. I think that is a good place to stop for today. So that way we can have 1 or 2 more questions before we adjourn.
So from IRT last semester, and I understand like the whole like differentiating, like trying to separate people from items, but you need people to to get data from
Yes.
to make. So how can you say that they're separate?
When I say separate, the claim is what can you do with the sum across items? And
Okay.
if you are using the sum across items as someone's indicator of their trait, like they don't have an F, you're just adding items up and calling that their trait, you cannot compare those scores unless they are taken from the exact same items.
Yeah.
Otherwise, someone could have a different sum or mean because of the items they answered, not because of anything else. So it's breaking the tie between what the score means. In theory, if you do it right, you can have a factor whose variation is interpretable regardless of which items they actually took, if everything is overlapping in the design and linked together. But overlap is the key. All right, what else?
I have an unrelated question.
Okay, super unrelated or like unrelated to that?
No, it's just tangential
Okay, tangential is fine.
to what we're talking about.
Okay.
I was curious if you are familiar at all with Gutmann scaling.
Gutmann scaling.
Gutmann scaling.
Yes, it's in Susan's book somewhere.
Yeah, and so like the idea is like you order your questions in a way that like like it's easier to endorse something.
Yeah,
and
less
it's harder.
severe is usually how
Yeah,
people
so like
talk
I
about
was
it.
thinking about the I feel sad and the
Mhm.
like ending my life one. Like the feel sad one would come earlier,
Yeah.
and then you kind of build up to that one. I'm just curious, like I've read about it in survey designs, but like how do you model that here, like on the back end? Like theoretically, if we had that scale.
You will get an estimate of what the severity of each item actually is, or for each transition between categories for ordinal items, and you can see to what extent you were right about the ordering. And I think the extent to which you can anticipate it based on theoretical and then actually see it play out in data is an argument for the validity of what you're measuring.
Yeah.
Because like if you found out with a scale where I have lots of energy was like the most severe thing, you'd be like, I don't think this is depression anymore.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. Anything else before we call it a day? Or a week, as it were? Yeah, it's not garbage day. That means I say have a good weekend. And I hope to see you next week. Do homework 0 if you haven't done it already. And let me know if you need anything. Bye.
I think you would have to get a shirt also if you sold merch.